two people, same job, same salary, let's say $80,000 a year. One of them retires at 45 and never works again. The other will still be clocking in at 70. Here's the strange part. It has almost nothing to do with how much they earn, which stocks they pick, or how clever they are. The only thing separating them is a single number, and by the end of this video, you'll know yours. Let's give them names. Maya, you might remember her from last time, and her colleague Daniel. They sit in the same office, do similar work, and take home the exact same paycheck. Think of this as a controlled experiment. Everything about their financial lives is identical, except for one variable we're going to change. Watch what that single change does. Most people, when they picture retiring sooner, picture earning more. A bigger salary, a promotion, maybe a lucky stock that takes off. That's the story we're sold, and it feels obvious. But it's mostly the wrong lever. Over the next few minutes, we're going to gently overturn that belief, because the math points somewhere far less glamorous and far more in your control. Here's the thesis up front. The single biggest factor in when you can retire isn't your income, and it isn't your investment returns. It's your savings rate, the percentage of your take-home pay you actually invest. This is the core insight behind Mr. Money Mustache's famous piece, the shockingly simple math behind early retirement. One number doing almost all the work. So what is a savings rate, plainly? Of every dollar that lands in your account, what share goes to your future self instead of being spent today? Save 20 cents of every dollar, and your savings rate is 20%. That's it. No jargon, no complicated formula. Just the slice of your pay that becomes investments. Why is this one number so unusually powerful? Because it works on both ends at once. A higher savings rate means you're investing more each month. That part's obvious, but it also means you're learning to live on less, which lowers the finish line you're aiming for in the first place. Two effects pulling in the same direction from a single decision. Before we get to your real target, let's talk about the number everyone fixates on. There's a cultural anchor, the so-called magic number people believe they need before they're allowed to retire. Surveys ask Americans this every year, and the figure is eye-watering. It's the kind of number that makes most people quietly assume retirement is something that happens to other people. In its 2026 Planning and Progress study, Northwestern Mutual found Americans think they'll need about $1.46 million to retire comfortably. For most people, that number lands like a wall. It feels impossible, even discouraging. And if that's your reaction, that's completely fair. A single intimidating figure isn't a plan, it's just a headline. Here's the reframe that turns fear into control. There is no universal magic number that everyone needs. Your target depends entirely on one thing: how much you spend in a year. Someone who lives on $40,000 needs far less than someone who spends $120,000. The number was never really about income. It's about your lifestyle, and your lifestyle is something you can shape. So instead of chasing some giant fixed sum, there's a far more elegant shortcut. Your target nest egg is simply a multiple of your annual spending. Not your salary, your spending. Once you know roughly what a year of your life costs, the math hands you a target. In a moment, we'll reveal the exact multiple. It makes the whole abstract idea suddenly concrete. The multiple is 25. Save roughly 25 times your annual expenses, and you've built a portfolio you can reasonably live off. This is the inverse of the well-known 4% rule. So if you spend $40,000 a year, your target is about $1 million. Spend less, and that million shrinks fast. Notice the number came from your spending, never your salary. Where does 25 come from? Flip it over, and you get the 4% rule. If 25 times spending is your pot, then withdrawing about 4% of it in the first year, adjusting for inflation after that, is the mirror image of the same idea. 1 divided by 4% is 25. Hold on to the phrase rule of thumb, though, because we'll stress test it honestly later. Now we reach the heart of it. Your savings rate doesn't just affect how much you end up with. It sets how long the whole journey takes, and the relationship isn't gentle and linear. It's a steep curve. Push your savings rate higher, and the working years don't drop one at a time. They fall away in chunks. Let's see exactly how. Here's the centerpiece, straight from that famous math. Save 10% of your take-home pay, and you're looking at roughly 51 working years. 20% gets you there in about 37, 50% around 17, 65% about 10 and a half, 75% near 7 years. The assumptions: a 5% real return and a 4% withdrawal rate. This table is the whole video in one frame. Sit with what that means for a real life. At a 10% savings rate, you're signing up for roughly a 50-year career. At 50%, you could be done in about 17. Same salary, same job, a completely different shape of life. This is exactly the gap between Maya and Daniel from the cold open. And now you can see what's driving it. And here's the part almost no one appreciates. Going from a 10% savings rate to 20 doesn't shave off a year or two. It cuts about 14 years, from roughly 51 down to 37. A modest bump in your rate buys an enormous amount of freedom. That's the non-linear payoff. Small, boring changes in the percentage produce outsized changes in your timeline. Let's make it concrete. Maya saves 50% of her take-home pay. Daniel saves 10. Same paycheck, remember, the only variable we changed. Maya is on track to be done in about 17 years. Daniel is looking at something closer to 50. That's the entire mystery from beat 1. Solved. Not salary, not genius, just one number, quietly compounding into 2 very different futures. Now the honest objection: I can't save 50%. Most people can't, and that's genuinely okay. The point here isn't extreme frugality, it's the direction. Every single percentage point you push your savings rate higher pulls your freedom date closer. You don't need to go to extremes to benefit. Moving from 10 to 15% still bends your timeline meaningfully in your favor. All of this rests on an engine: investment returns. That 5% we keep using is a real return, meaning after inflation has been subtracted. It's a deliberately modest figure. Historically, a broad stock index has delivered more like 7% real over the long run, but markets are bumpy and unpredictable year to year. We use the conservative number on purpose, so the math leans cautious rather than rosy. And you don't get there by being a genius or timing the market. You get there by doing something almost boring: investing a consistent amount automatically through every market mood. Up years, down years, scary headlines, all of it. As we covered before, dollar cost averaging just means showing up on schedule. Applied to a retirement target, that steady discipline is what actually carries you across the line. One more callback worth its own beat: fees. A 1% fee doesn't just cost you a little money, it quietly steals years of compounding. Over decades, that drag can push your freedom date further out, even if your savings rate is solid. So choosing low-cost index funds isn't a minor detail. It's one of the few levers that can literally move your retirement date earlier. Now, maybe retiring at 45 isn't your goal at all, and that's perfectly reasonable. For a normal retirement age, the conventional rule of thumb is gentler. Invest around 15% of your gross income consistently over a working career. It's the guidance you'll hear from places like Fidelity and Schwab. Not as dramatic, but steady, sensible, and well within reach for many people. So think of it as one dial, not two separate worlds. 15% is the gentle setting, a conventional retirement age, no heroics required. Crank the dial higher and you buy earlier freedom. It's the same underlying math either way. You're just choosing where to set it. The right number is the one you can actually live with and stick to. There's also a shift worth planning for as your date approaches. During the building years, you can lean heavily into growth. But near the finish line, many people gradually de-risk, holding more bonds and cash, so a crash right before retirement doesn't blow up the plan. That gentle shift is called a glide path. A mix like 60% stocks, 30 bonds, 10 cash is one common example. Let's pull the plan together. Find your annual spending. Multiply by about 25. Pick a savings rate, and the math hands you a rough date. Honestly, it feels almost too simple. And whenever something feels that clean, that's exactly the moment to slow down and get honest about its limits. So let's do that. Here's the part a lot of channels skip. The 4% rule and its 25 times cousin are useful rules of thumb, not guarantees. They're a starting point for thinking, not a promise carved in stone. Being honest about that is the whole point of this channel. So let's separate from both the dry calculators and the hype crowd and look at where these rules actually strain. First caveat, it was built for roughly 30 years. When the financial planner Bill Bengen originally tested the 4% rule, he was modeling a retirement of about 3 decades, and it held up well across history for that window. But if you retire early and need your money to last 40 or 50 years, you're leaning on that rule harder than it was ever designed for. Second, modern research is more cautious. In a 2021 study, Morningstar put a safe starting withdrawal rate closer to 3.3%, at a 90% success target, and more recent work lands near a 4%. The takeaway isn't panic, it's that a real, non-trivial chance of falling short exists. These are probabilities, not certainties, and it's healthier to treat them that way. What do you do with that? Nothing dramatic. A slightly lower safe rate simply means a slightly bigger target. Instead of 25 times your spending, you might aim for 28 or 30. That extra cushion buys a meaningful margin of safety. It's not a reason to be scared. It's a lever in your hands, and a fairly forgiving one at that. Third, there's something called sequence of returns risk. In plain English, a bad crash in the first few years of retirement hurts far more than the same crash later on. Why? Because you're selling shares to live on while they're down, locking in the damage. The same average return can play out fine, or painfully depending purely on its order. This is exactly why that glide path matters. Fourth, and maybe the most important, real versus nominal. Your number has to be in today's purchasing power, because inflation quietly eats away at what your money can buy. $1 million decades from now won't stretch as far as it does today. Bill Bengen now calls inflation the retiree's greatest enemy. That's precisely why we used real after-inflation returns throughout this whole video. After all those caveats, here's the reassuring truth. None of this requires being fearless or getting it perfect. The biggest risk to your retirement usually isn't the math at all, It's quitting, stopping when markets get scary. Starting at a modest savings rate and simply staying consistent beats a flawless plan you never actually begin. Boring, steady, and started. That's the winning combination. A necessary word. This video is for education, not financial advice. These are rules of thumb, not promises, and past performance never guarantees future results. Your situation, your taxes, your goals, your timeline is yours alone. Before acting on any of this, please talk to a licensed financial professional who can look at your full picture. We're here to explain the ideas, not prescribe your plan. So let's close the loop on Maya and Daniel. Maya, the 50% saver, crosses her finish line sometime in her 40s. Daniel, saving 10% on the very same paycheck, is still decades away. It wasn't a bigger salary, a hot stock, or some secret talent. It came down to one number, the share of her pay she chose to invest. Here's what you can actually do tonight. Add up roughly what a year of your life costs. Multiply that by about 25 to 30 to find your target. Then look at your savings rate and nudge it up just 1 percentage point at a time. That's genuinely the whole game. No magic, no hype, just a number you can quietly raise. If this made the math feel a little less intimidating, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. And here's the question almost everyone asks next. When you've got money to invest, should you dump it in all at once or spread it out over time? It's one of the most argued about myths in investing, and next time we'll calmly take it apart. Until then, stay invested and stay chilled.